Thank you. Thank you all for joining me today. And WFAN, for those of you in Iowa, it's a good day to be inside. It is currently snowing where I am, and we had some ice earlier. So good day for a webinar. I'm just gonna fix some things here so I can see my screen a little better. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and do my own introduction. I am Sarah Nizzi. I'm a Farm Bill Pollinator Conservation Planner and NRCS partner biologist with the Xerces Society. And when I say NRCS, I'm referring to the Natural Resource Conservation Services. I work within the state with farmers and landowners to implement diverse native habitat, particularly with the lens of pollinators, with really anyone on private land at really any scale. So that can be like the farmers of all different varieties, as well as acreage owners or schools or cities or private municipalities. I did a project with the VA hospital in Des Moines. So really no shortage of work. I also help train NRCS staff and partner staff within the state to equip them with more knowledge and skills and tools and abilities to talk about native habitat and pollinators and beneficial insects, as well as influencing state policy with NRCS practice standards and specifications. Education outreach, publications, lots of different things. And I am really excited to talk about this topic today. It is near and dear to my heart. I am completely biased and do really enjoy working with fruit and vegetable growers. Putting habitat into these systems just makes so much sense, and it's so much easier to really see the fruits of that labor through pollination services and pest control with beneficial insects, because so often these foods that we are eating are either dependent or heavily reliant on pollination services and are often organic or practicing organic. And so that the natural enemy beneficial insect control is really important. So let's get started. If my computer will go. All right, so just an overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to briefly explain conservation biological biocontrol, which is basically just utilizing our natural enemies within the landscape for pest control. The components of habitat for beneficial insects and pollinators, what are those key considerations or the boxes that we should be checking when we're thinking about habitat? On-farm options, organic site prep, that could be a whole webinar in and of itself. So I'm not going to be able to deep dive into that, unfortunately, but I am going to talk about it a little bit. The different plant materials for these projects, and then lastly, resources and cost share opportunities. So insects really are the little things that run the world. Only about 2% of insects are what we consider to be pests or undesirable. The vast majority are important to us as humans and to ecosystem functions. And E.O. Wilson also said that in terms of invertebrates, kind of generally speaking, so thinking about insects and beyond, humans would only be able to survive merely 3 to 4 months without invertebrates. So very important to making the world go round. And insects are a very, very diverse group globally, but there are the subset of insects that we consider beneficial insects. And there's a huge variety of insects that fall under this umbrella. We have lacewings in the upper left, followed by ladybugs, ground beetles, predatory wasps, parasitic wasps, stink bugs, hoverflies, also known as flower flies, mites, fireflies. There's really no shortage, rove beetles, and each one has a different life history and a different strategy to combat pests, as well as potentially in terms of ground beetles, consuming weed seeds, which should also be really beneficial. So pretty neat group of insects that don't quite get enough attention. But stepping back and thinking about biological control, it's essentially using living organisms to provide pest control. And there are 3 types that are commonly used: the classical and or introduced, the augmentative, and then conservation biocontrol, also known as CBC. So the classical biological control, I think, is what many of us are familiar with. It's the widespread release and establishment of non-native natural enemy from the pest native range. Often this is done by government agencies or scientists. It can lead to long-term pest reduction, but can also have ecological and economical harm. And I think a good example of this is the Japanese beetle, which we all love. Augmentative biological control is a temporary control. They're often confined into small spaces, used in greenhouses for pest control. And the goal is not to establish any populations anywhere, or at least not try to. Conservation biological control, on the other hand, is again just supporting those natural enemies that already exist within the landscapes by providing habitat. There are many benefits to offering space for beneficial insects. They can be an alternative to insecticides. They can support natural ecosystems, adding value to pollinators and other wildlife, increasing farm diversity, reducing unintended consequences, which we'll talk, like I did kind of mention with Japanese beetles, but we'll talk about it more, and also reducing management costs. Beneficial insects can aid in decomposition, aerate the soil, just a number of different abilities and services that we can take advantage of. And studies have shown that if more than 20% of a farm is, set aside in diverse habitat, pest control by beneficial insects is observed, excuse me. And there's also a direct link between habitat and beneficial insect abundance and diversity, which makes a lot of sense. If you have habitat, diverse habitat, you're going to be supporting a wide array of insects as well as other wildlife species. So it's kind of a no-brainer. There are also, of course, economical benefits to beneficial insects, roughly $4.5 to $12 billion annually for US crops, and 100 billion worldwide. And this is just a fun photo of a parasitic wasp attacking a molted tortoise beetle. So it's a very, very small wasp making a very big deal. So often overseen and not looked. The buzz on insect decline, we talk about this a lot with pollinators, certainly with honeybees and with monarchs, and it's getting lots of attention in the media. And certainly the last 4 to 5 years, the buzz on insect decline and pollinators has just skyrocketed. I don't feel like this was something we were really talking about early on in my career as much. But there are declines with insects globally, as well as just biodiversity in general. We have insect declines happening locally in the state of Iowa, within the Midwest, within North America. So definitely something to be paying attention to and something we should be taking seriously, taking action towards. We know enough to act now, therefore we should. And there are many different ways that we can support insects to reduce, slow down, or reverse these declines. And we see that when beneficial insects decline, pests increase. When those spaces are left empty, they can go a little haywire. And with climate change, being amongst climate change right now, pests within the agricultural landscape are, predicted to only get worse. So I think it's important for us to consider utilizing these natural enemies and providing habitat for them. Pests thrive in monocultures. They do not need diversity to keep themselves going, just kind of like invasive plant species, they can create their own monocultures and do just fine, but our beneficial insects do need more, and that includes our native grasses, our wildflower species, and nesting and overwintering habitat. But habitats, these insects, they do predate. They are eating and consuming crop pests either throughout their life or at certain life stages, but they're also going to be utilizing habitat for floral resources for other reasons. Pollen provides protein, which is critical for egg development. And then having this diverse diet also increases reproduction and longevity. And again, this alternate food source. There are times when crops may be absent or their numbers may be really low. So beneficial insects may also be feeding on pests that are not crop pests. But for example, in this photo, it's aphids on milkweed. So habitat can provide, all sorts of alternative food sources. So how can we prevent pest problems? We create a farming environment that supports beneficial insects and pollinators. So now I'm going to get into the habitat piece of this presentation and really go over the food. And nectar, pollen, and host plants is pretty specific to pollinators, but beneficial insects can also benefit from nectar and pollen, nesting, overwintering sites, and then breeding opportunities. Having habitat ensures that these individuals don't have to travel far in order to find one another, and protection from pesticides. So early foraging habitat often comes in the form of trees or shrubs. Trees and shrubs are some of the earliest blooming plants on top of some of the early spring woodland ephemerals that we have. But there are many native species that not only are going to be able to provide forage for early emerging butterflies, bumblebees, or solitary native bees, but that can also provide overwintering and nesting shelter. We are always talking about bloom periods with pollinators. I think that's something that most everybody pretty much has down. I think we all have a good understanding that we need flowers from spring to fall. But it's important because there are insects that are active throughout the growing season at many different times. Bumblebees are active for about 6 months out of the year, so they need something to eat for a long period of time. But then there are individuals like mining bees that are only active pretty much around Easter time for just 3 to 4 weeks out of the year. So they're going to be utilizing only those spring blooming species. And then an opposite example would be longhorn bees that are active in the late summer, early fall. So they're going to need, the asters and the goldenrods and the thistles that they often use as forage. And then there are butterflies and moths that are coming out onto the scene at various times for various lengths. The monarch is pretty active throughout the growing season, but not every butterfly has that same life cycle or every moth. So that's why we want to be sure that we have season-long bloom and that there's a seat at the table for everyone when it is their turn to come out. And early season and spring blooms are often the most challenging season to kind of check that box. The availability of spring prairie species is not quite as high as we would like it. Not everyone sells woodland spring ephemerals, things like that. So that's where trees and shrubs can also come into play. And not every native plant is created equal. They're not all offering the same food resources. So we have our pollinator plants and our nectar plants. And examples of native plant species within the Midwest that are providing only pollen would be spiderwort, foxglove penstemon, and partridge pea. But we do have a number of native plants that are providing both pollen and nectar, but it is important to understand that sometimes that's not always the case, and that diversity is going to ensure that there's no gaps in resources. Nectar is the carbohydrates and the amino acids, basically the fuel to keep these organisms going, and milkweed is an example of a native plant that is only providing a nectar. And when we think about monarch butterflies, we're also often thinking about nectar plants. And the reason that's so important is because, again, these carbohydrates, the fuel that ensures that they are able to make their journey back to their overwintering sites. But thankfully, we don't have to think about this too deeply very often because so many of our native plants are providing both. Host plants are more than just milkweeds. I'm talking a lot about monarchs, but it's just an easy example that we often, we're very aware of monarchs and milkweed, but basically every plant has some sort of close associated relationship with an insect. So our wildflowers are host plants to many other different types of Lepidoptera, our butterflies and moths. So our black swallowtails, for example, are going to utilize plants out of the carrot family, like dill or golden alexanders. Skippers prefer native bunch grasses as their host plants. Oak trees support hundreds of Lepidoptera larvae, and other trees as well, and shrubs. And lastly, we have the nesting and overwintering habitat, which can look a lot alike. Kind of if you're checking one box, you're likely checking the other box. In really simple terms, it means just having some untidy and messiness around the house, around the farm, around the acreage, brush piles, rock piles, leaf litter, any sort of duff, overgrown grass, idle areas. Undisturbed ground is really critical. 70 to 80% of our native solitary bees are nesting in the ground. So it's good to have sparse areas where they're able to utilize those as nesting sites. Not cutting our stems back until the springtime is really critical. Allowing them to stand tall and stay the same throughout the winter season, and then coming back maybe in early May and cutting stems to roughly 18 to 24 inches or anywhere in between, and then allowing that regrowth to grow around those nesting sites will provide a home and forage opportunities really close by for those solitary tunnel nesting bees. But there are some considerations to keep in mind when thinking about native habitat. And this really, this particular webinar is geared towards specialty crop growers that are typically smaller farms, smaller areas, especially within urban or suburban landscapes. But these kind of questions really fit anyone, anywhere. What are the goals? What are you trying to accomplish, first and foremost? What equipment is accessible or feasible, or do you own any equipment? Will labor be an issue? In terms of small farms, often there is potentially one person, employed or trying to get by with the help of volunteers. So are there staff, are there volunteers available to help with the installation as well as the long-term management to ensure the success of these projects? Are there potential cost share opportunities? Do you live close by? Lots of considerations to think about in terms of what may be the best option and make most sense for your site-specific space. Some different priorities or goals that folks might have in mind when thinking about specialty crop farms is diversity, perhaps that pollination services and the pest control, especially if they're organic or practicing organic. The aesthetics, just especially in urban places, it's nice to have some beauty in areas, using it as an educational component or just engaging with the community, as well as soil health, water quality, and climate change benefits, and just building that resilience within the system. But small farms really have no shortages of challenges, especially urban and suburban farms. Space, budget, labor, time, those are probably the really big ones, but also, again, equipment that may or may not be readily available, decision makers. Some community gardens or farms are a 501c3, so there may be multiple people at the table making decisions that may make it harder or easier. Organic practices, again, I've said it multiple times now that these folks are typically either certified organic or practicing organic methods, therefore likely going to be implementing habitat organically, and that can have its own set of challenges. It is by no means impossible, but it just takes a little more time, a little more thought. The plant materials, which can kind of be determined on your budget, local policies and restraints, the amount of strange city ordinances and homeowner association rules, and all of that can be problematic in a number of different ways. Technical assistance may or may not be available, financial assistance, and I'm sure there are many more that I'm not currently thinking of, but those are some that we've often run into. But despite that, despite the challenges that exist, it is possible to, even in small spaces, to put in really beautiful, great habitat. And these pictures on this slide are from a small urban farm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I believe the farm is like maybe 2 acres in size, and the farm manager installed I believe just over 500 square feet of beetle banks, which I'll talk more about here very shortly. But it was just a super neat project that he was really into, and it went really, really well. But other options are insectary strips, flowering cover crops, which can be like a relatively easy option, tree and shrub plantings, etc. And I'll go over some of these. So beetle banks have been getting a lot of traction in the upper Midwest within the last couple of years. They are a habitat practice that originated in the UK. Essentially, they installed beetle banks to make up for the loss of hedgerows that they had removed for agricultural production. They are historically planted with only native bunch grasses because that provides overwintering and nesting shelter for ground beetles, which this practice it supports beneficial insects, but its main purpose is to foster ground beetle activity. And we at Xerces have experimented with diversifying those mixes a little bit and doing about 2/3 native bunch grasses and 1/3 wildflowers. So adding a wildflower component, because we know that flowers are beneficial to our natural enemies, as well as supporting pollinators. But they're typically planted within or adjacent to crops, and that we've put them in organic row crop situations as well as our fruit and vegetable farms. They're typically 2 to 6 feet wide. That just kind of depends on the size of the farm, how much space is able to be taken out of production or set aside to not be put into production. And they can be bermed. This was actually a bermed planting. You can't really tell. It was put together with a bed-tilled bed shaper. Can't remember if I'm saying that right. But that essentially a berm will just dry the area out sooner in the season so that the ground beetles are able to get out into the crop field sooner. But they can be installed on flat ground so long as the area is relatively dry. I have a photo of a 2-spotted stink bug bullying a Colorado potato beetle, and that was the main pest on this farm in Johnston County, Iowa. They were having issues with their Colorado potato beetles, so the farm manager was pretty stoked when he was seeing some of these bugs working in action a couple of years later. And they installed a huge, I think over 1,400 square feet of beetle banks along their crop fields. So that was a very large undertaking. We also have perennial native insectary strips as an option. These are basically kind of the opposite ratio. They're going to be very heavy on wildflowers with a smaller component of our native grasses, really geared towards pollinators and those pollinating services. But certainly going to support beneficial insects as well. But beetle banks and perennial native insectary strips are, planted to perennial vegetation. So it's a commitment, making space for that. It's intended to be a long-term habitat enhancement. So you want to be sure that you're committed to these areas for the long term and are willing and able to convert those areas. But there are options that are temporary, short-term, easier to install, much cheaper, have minimal site preparation, and those are our annual insectary strips that are often planted with non-native species that can also provide cut flowers, nitrogen fixing, and weed control. So this is similar to where you're going to be supporting pollinators mostly and some beneficial insects, But it's a nice like stepping stone, or it's kind of better than nothing. It's doing a little bit of something to help support these insects at a low cost and low commitment. So you're able to kind of move things around, and if you're making changes within your system, et cetera. Similarly, you could do intercropping with flowering annuals, where you're essentially planting flowering lanes amongst all of your crops. And again, it's a lower cost, it's minimal site prep, it has some of those same additional benefits, and they're going to be temporary. We also have the option of flowering cover crops. So just allowing cover crops to flower can be, buckwheat is really a favorite, which is shown in the lower right, a favorite of beneficial insects like flies and wasps. They are really attracted to white flowers, but there are some other butterflies that might forage on them as well. So that's just an example. But we do have warm season and cool season options, or you can make a cocktail of cover crops if you'd like. But again, that's kind of just another kind of minimal strategy that can glean some benefits. Trees or shrubs are great because they're low maintenance and minimal space. They might be more expensive up front, but there's not going to be more of that long-term management as some of these other plantings or these native perennial plantings would have. For smaller areas, this is a great strategy. And not only do they provide forage, but they're also potentially going to provide the nesting and overwintering habitat as well. So something that we don't often think enough about is trees and shrubs. And drift protection, this sort of drift protection doesn't really apply to urban and suburban areas. Often we don't have enough space to put in windbreaks. But drift and pesticide exposure within urban and suburban areas is definitely something to think about. It certainly takes place. There are cities and towns that fog for mosquitoes, and residents putting out pesticides and insecticides. So I mean, every landscape is going to be running into some sort of pesticide exposure, but for anyone that may be on the edge of town, or anyone that has an acreage and is just simply concerned about pesticide drift, there are ways that you can use windbreaks to mitigate that. And we want to be sure that we're only using conifer species, and more specifically spruce, juniper, fir, or arborvitae. Those have the ideal porosity that kind of allows the drift to be able to filter through very slowly. Pine, for example, is too porous. It's just going to flow right on through there. If you have too dense of a windbreak, you'll actually, the pesticide drift will just hit a wall and go up and over. So we really aim for that roughly 60% density and 40% porosity. So just something to keep in mind. Switching gears a little bit, I've talked a lot, or just kind of alluded to organic site prep quite a bit. So I did want to talk about it for a little while and have a few slides for it. We do have a pretty comprehensive publication pictured here that really deep dives into each and every one of these organic site prep options, and outlines, kind of the pros and cons, considerations, when it makes sense, when it doesn't make sense, cost analysis, et cetera, plus case studies. So you can actually read examples on, they planted this at this time, et cetera, et cetera. And the options that are starred, those are ones that we have the most intimate experience with in the upper Midwest. So solarization, smother cropping, tillage, organic herbicides, and sod removal. They all kind of have their pros and cons, and they certainly make sense in certain spaces. It's not a one size fits all by any means. So there's considerations to think about when thinking about organic site preparation. What is the current vegetation? If you're working in a system and thinking of putting in habitat that's already been in production, likely your weed pressure is going to be lower because you've already been combating those weeds over and over through your agricultural production. But if you're utilizing, say, a mowed lane or just an idle area that hasn't been used for anything else, that weed pressure is going to be perennial, likely, and very high. So that's going to determine which method makes sense, or which combinations of methods you might use. How big is the site? What equipment is available, mechanical, plant material, water. Smother crops are essentially using cover crops to suppress weeds. And with the amount of droughts that we've been having lately, that's been a challenge. So are you going to have to potentially water an area that you smother cropped? If you're using tillage, when you have dry years, tillage is not great because you really want that moisture to allow the weeds to continue to grow, till. So things to think about. And then, is there a concrete deadline for the project? And this really applies to anyone that might be getting funding from an outside source, whether that be a grant or a farm bill program. Oftentimes, there's restraints on when you can get implementation done. And for organic site prep, it's best if we can do it a complete growing season or two to really suppress and reduce the weeds present. But really, adaptive weed management, it's kind of the same as just with any other conventional, traditional conversion to habitats. We want to tailor the approach to best target the weeds on site. Want to focus on those persistent, perennial, invasive, problematic weeds, and then understand that it may take multiple seasons or multiple methods, a combination of smother cropping and tillage, or tillage and organic herbicides, etc. There are some things that we can do to help with the weeds through the planting process, choosing aggressive species that establish really well, that do well on their own. When doing organic site prep, that can really come in handy. Having as much diversity as possible, filling in all of those niches to ensure that there's native plants to compete with the non-natives. Using a high seeding rate could be an option. And then considering container plants or plugs if needed. And for a small scale, like 1/10 of an acre or less, it's more feasible to use plugs, which have a competitive edge. They're already pretty well established, they're already been grown. They can compete better than just doing a seeding. But of course, there's always management post-planting or seeding, regardless of which method you choose. So if you're doing a seeding, you're going to do those establishment mowings the first growing season, ideally 3 times that year, or potentially 1 or 2 the second year. If you're using plugs, you're going to be out there, hand pulling or using a weed whacker to control weeds. And then constantly, no matter what, just doing that ongoing spot treatment of weeds and just evaluating and monitoring the site to kind of, keep the weeds at bay. All right, so plant materials. Oftentimes, we are working with kind of these native perennial habitat projects. And so we're using either plugs or transplants or seed. And there's pros and cons to both. Plugs are often really great because they are, they have a root system established, they have a competitive edge, you're going to see your effects a lot sooner, but they can be really expensive, and they can be, labor intensive. Seed is often cheaper, but it takes much more time to establish. It also can have some labor associated with it or extra equipment needed. We have a pretty simple kind of 2-page fact sheet that goes over the pros and cons, or just a compare and contrast from starting from seed or starting from transplants, and kind of just going over the different considerations to think about and what might make most sense for your particular situation. And on the flip side, we have annuals versus perennials, and kind of the compare and contrast with those situations as well. And I just thought I would put in some testimonials from a couple of projects that we've done, where so far plugs really seem to be leading the way, and most small farms are in favor of plugs. And one of my favorite comments was referred to the beetle banks was coolest project I've done on this farm so far, or thus far. So we also have these habitat assessment guides for either pollinator habitat or beneficial insect habitat, in which you can, basically walk around your farm or your area and kind of look around and think about your landscape context, where you are in the world, and are you in kind of a biological desert, or do you have, if you're in an urban or suburban areas or community garden nearby, or do your neighbors have gardens and flowers or other habitats near? Are you providing food? Is there food available? Nesting, overwintering, protection from pesticides? So it'll walk you through all of these components, and you can essentially grade yourself in your area and see, oh, I might be providing food, but I could do a lot better in terms of nesting. And so this goes with both different groups of insects. And once you implement or make changes or enhancements, you can go back and you can regrade yourself and say, yay, I meet all the benchmarks, or I still need to work on X, Y, and Z. There are some Farm Bill opportunities available. These are kind of the big Farm Bill programs that are most common. The Conservation Reserve Program is administered by the Farm Service Agency, doesn't really apply to urban or suburban small farms. And the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program also doesn't really apply to this scenario either. So that's why I have the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program highlighted. And although these programs exist and that there is cost share available for certain practices, I can only speak for Iowa, but I will say that we are not set up very well to support urban and suburban, or really small farms in general, for habitat projects specifically. Our policy, our practice standards and our policies just aren't written in a way that make it easy to provide cost share for these practices. So I've been working for the last 2 or 3 years to try to help make changes in that regard. And there is a push from the national NRCS to do more work within urban farms and provide more resources. And Iowa also is working hard and has a committee that unfortunately I'm not on to better serve these growers. And I think it's really important to do so, because I think they've just been kind of left out this entire time, and not every small farm is out in the country or has other idle adjacent ground next to it where they can put in habitat and such. So these things may be available to you. They may not. And then, of course, there's other options outside of habitat, like help with mulching or irrigation or high tunnels through EQIP. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox on that one. But a positive note in that regard is that Practical Farmers of Iowa and the Xerces Society have partnered together to submit a grant to work with urban and suburban growers, particularly in underserved communities, to help with the technical and financial assistance in regards specifically to on-farm habitat projects. We know that this is kind of lacking currently within Iowa NRCS, so we're basically going to hopefully get farms signed up to implement these practices and learn what practices make sense, what don't, the challenges, all of those things. But we will provide assistance with, financial assistance with the plant materials, that'll be covered, the implementation, the technical assistance, all of that. So the only caveat is that you must be EQIP eligible. But myself, as well as staff at PFI, we are more than happy to walk anyone through that process if they're unsure if they're EQIP eligible, or how that works with the application. But I haven't ran into any hurdles quite yet, but there could be. So that's just really the only asterisk. So if anyone is interested in potentially learning more about this grant opportunity, it's going to be going on for the next like 2.5 years in terms of actual habitat work. So there's plenty of time to think about it, or share it with someone else who might be interested. We have a brand new resource available through the Xerces Society that I'm really excited about and really proud of. It's geared towards the upper Midwest, but it's essentially a how-to for beetle banks to support beneficial insects. So it walks you through all of the site prep, plant selection, where to plant, management. It gives you suggested plant species, etc. So this, I don't have any in-hand copies, but I will at the Practical Farmers of Iowa conference. And then it is available online on our website. And our website hosts a plethora of resources and information on native plant lists, conservation, biological control, organic site prep methods, really no shortage of information out there. If there's something specific that someone is looking for that you can't find, always feel free to email me. Oftentimes it's much easier for me to find it, and I have no problem helping anyone out in that regard. We are a donor-supported nonprofit, so if you are not a member, we always encourage you to be one. It's Giving Tuesday, if you haven't all heard of that, which I'm sure you have. I know I've got a ton of emails. But we do appreciate all of our individual members. They do make up a large portion of our revenue, over 40% last year. And it's really through the help of our individual memberships and our farm partners that allow us to continue to do the work that we do. We would not know the things we know if we didn't have our farm partners working alongside with us, being able to experiment and be guinea pigs and try new things. So we really, really appreciate it. I just have to take a moment to thank all of our big time Xerces supporters, and thanks to WFAN for allowing me to speak with you all today. And with that, I will go ahead and take questions. And we've got about 15 minutes or so. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah,
Yeah.
for sharing. I'm like so excited about the possibility of even growing anything now that there's snow on the ground. So I appreciate all the beautiful flowers and all of the wonderful knowledge you shared with us. So if folks want to use the raise hand function to ask questions, you can go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side, and then the little raise hand function is there. And we can take questions that way. Otherwise, if you dropped any questions in the chat, I'll just be putting those into in the Whova chat. I'll be putting those into the Zoom chat shortly here. So whatever way works best for y'all.
Okay, I do see one question in the Whova. Says, what is a practice that increases pollinators that could be considered a good place to start for farmers and landowners? Okay, perfect. We got that in the Zoom. I think just having any sort of flowers, I mean, really, or even having like that messiness of overwintering and nesting opportunities. Native flowers are going to be your best bet, but even if you allow some areas to just kind of go wild, there's likely going to be at least some kind of not as high quality native plants, but there will be goldenrods or native thistles or asters, or probably not a lot of spring species. We've kind of depleted a lot of those, but there are some areas that if left untouched can support at least a minimal amount of forage. But if you do have some non-native landscaping type plants, they will be utilized. They just won't offer as much in terms of pollen and nectar because they are not, they're bred to be showy and to be aesthetically pleasing, not to really support insects. So those are easy things. The no mow May is super duper popular, and that's like sort of a stepping stone. It's not bad by any means, allowing some of those, creeping Charlie or white clover or dandelions to bloom in the early springtime. It doesn't support a large amount of pollinators, only certain species have the tongue lengths to utilize those flowers. But it's certainly a very small step, and it doesn't take a whole lot of effort, but really planting plants, and that can be a few or a lot, or letting areas kind of go wild. Yes, and flowering cover crops. Like in terms of farmers, like I think that is probably one of the easiest things that could be done. So thank you, Stace, for that. What are some of your top species for large garden scale pollinator strips? And do any of those also provide good support for natural enemies? Great question. So thinking about kind of spring, summer, and fall, I love grasses. So like little, I don't know if height is an issue, but like little blue stem, side oats, those are all short grasses that play really well, that are host plants, and also provide overwintering and nesting. But native thistles are by far like my favorite, but those can be really tall, so those aren't always applicable for every situation. Golden Alexanders are really good for beneficial insects, flies and wasps particularly. Bergamot is like a superfood for pollinators, especially bumblebees. Joe Pideweed is another superfood for bumblebees. Goldenrods and asters later in the season. Yeah, gosh, Liatris, like, I don't know. I love all the plants. I can't name them all, but just if you have just at least a few, like 3, let's say, spring, summer, and fall, hopefully you're supporting, that are different shapes and different colors, gonna be supporting at least a few natural enemies. But for beneficial insects in particular, like flies and wasps, they like those kind of smaller flowers, like yarrow and buckwheat or golden alexanders, and then tend to like white flowers. I don't know why, I'm not an entomologist. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question. No, but not forgetting grasses. Grasses are so important. They often are overlooked. Okay, leaves. Do leaves collected from neighbors in big paper bags help with overwintering, or should they be spread across the ground? I'm an advocate for leaving the leaves. Putting them in paper bags probably isn't, typically people put them in paper bags and then they get taken off to the landfill or composted or wherever else they may go, or we think they may go. I'm a proponent of leaving them. Sometimes certain trees like maples or sycamores just have huge masses of leaves. So it's fine to rake some of those up and either compost them, or you could bag them if you want, but leaving some areas of leaves, kind of, dedicating certain areas where under trees or next to the house or by a fence in the backyard, whatever. Those are beneficial for overwintering sites for snails and larvae and lots of bumblebees. And the second question, how are cosmos, zinnias, and marigolds? Those will be visited by some pollinator species. They're just not going to support a large diversity of species. Some will be able to forage on those. And again, they're not going to be offering or really providing as much pollen and nectar resources as our native plants. But you could plant them on farms. People certainly do, and they do see benefits from that. And so it's certainly an option. And I know within kind of the home landscape, I like having kind of native and non-native flowers, because there's a lot of non-native flowers that I think are just pretty. And so why not? And let's see, I'll check back over here. Okay, there's a question on the Huba. Are there particular cost share options that you have found helpful for farmers and landowners to increase pollinator habitat adoption on their land? Yeah, it depends on the scenario in which, are you an agricultural producer or are you just a landowner? That kind of separates you out. There's many cost share opportunities available to agricultural producers, whether that be specialty crops or row crops. But for landowners, you're often kind of limited to your options. In Iowa, we have something called the Prairie Partners Program, which is administered by the DNR that targets landowners specifically and gives them cost share for seed. Essentially, they'll pay for 50% of the native seed cost, which can be the most expensive component when doing kind of a large scale prairie planting. They typically want 2 acres or more, but they made that program to help those group of individuals because they often don't have cost share funding available. And then for your ag producers, there's the federal options that I mentioned during the webinar, but there's also through the Iowa Department of Land and Ag Stewardship for the Iowa folks here, they have state cost share for native plantings as well as windbreaks. There could be kind of local options available. And, is it increasing adoption throughout the state that they're available? I'm not totally sure, but they do exist and they are available for certain folks. So, and there's, the DNR also has the Iowa Habitat and Access Program. So I think, in Iowa, we've got quite a few different things to choose from that come with different eligibility, different contract terms, all sorts of stuff. Let's see. If you could, oh gosh, this sounds like a hefty question. If you could design the perfect farm bill, what percentage of the farm would you want in native plants? Would you like on the land? And let's tie that to the crop insurance. Nice. Not really sure I 100% understand that question. If someone wants to raise their hand and clarify, feel free. What percentage of the farm I'd want in native plants? I don't know. I mean, farms come in all sizes and different what kind of farms are we talking about? I always want more habitat on the landscape. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yes. So if 20%, yes, that's where you can actually see a benefit, a correlation between having the habitat and getting the benefits. But okay. Thanks, Stace. I appreciate the effort. So yeah, and it also depends on the cropping system too, because not every cropping system is going to benefit from pollination services like corn and soybeans. Soybeans are take it or leave it, and corn is wind pollinated. So, but I'm a proponent of having as much perennial habitat as possible. I am an ecologist, so I love my farms. I love my specialty crop farms. So I think having as much habitat as possibly available for them is a win-win. But within just the Iowa landscape, I would love to see habitat around every body of water. How about that? That's a good start. I don't know how much land that would be, but that would be nice. So yeah, I'm sorry if I butchered that question for whoever asked. And it looks like, let's see.
I see that, Stace, you have your hand up. Were you wanting to ask a question?
Yeah. Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I was just curious what Xerxes kind of experiences with the NRCS agents at this point. Do you feel like that they are becoming better educated, for lack of a nicer way to put it, about the benefits of this type of habitat and forage, and that maybe might that finally influence the way that they weight or do the different percentages on the CSP programs. I mean, I did a 4-year program, and the piece of that money that I got percentage wise was quite tiny for the habitat and forage. And that to me was the most important part.
Right.
So I had to say yes to a bunch of other things like, no-till and,
Right.
monitoring water infiltration and all kinds of crazy stuff that actually ended up being a ton of record keeping, when my whole
Mhm.
goal was just like, make forage, make make habitat. And so I asked this question. My local agent just retired, so I'm kind of waiting to see who replaces him, hoping that's like a younger, more educated agrarian with an ecological, bend to their way of looking at things. But I just wondered if at an organizational level, do you guys feel within Xerces that you're like making inroads in helping this group? Because these are the guys who are advising farmers, right? They're the guys who you sit down with and you make the plan and say, how much money is my check going to be for? So I know how much, seed I can buy and how much labor
Right.
it's going to take and all that. So I just kind of wanted to know, like from a 30,000 foot view,
Sure.
do you see it getting better?
Yeah, and it's so tough. It's such a tough, interesting world to be a part of. And we have many different partner biologists across the country working with NRCS, either at a state level, a 2-state level, or a regional level at tech centers. And we do at Xerces influence policy with FSA and NRCS nationally, as well as within state levels. And so I want to say that, yes, we have been moving the needle some, but there's still so much work to do. And I think in terms of Iowa, I do feel like there are a number of different offices that really are interested in wildlife habitat, just generally. I think first of all, you have to check that box in order to kind of help out with all the others to get in with pollinators and everything else. But so many of the staff have such different backgrounds, where some are just ag, some are wildlife oriented, so it's really, really challenging. And part of my job is to expose these staff to these ideas and get them thinking more about it. And I think in Iowa, it is getting better. I can't guarantee that every young person is going to be like super into habitat, but it does seem like most of them are. And I think if we can get them out in the field more, that would be really critical, but it's hard for them to do that. And essentially NRCS staff have to know a little bit about literally everything. I mean, they have to know about tillage and cover crops and soil health and infrastructure and engineering and wildlife. And like, I would not want that job at all. So I'm lucky that I just am niche focused, but I do think it's going to get better. I think nationally they're trying to do things to make it better. So fingers crossed, but oftentimes, if we can all just kind of help them along and do our part. But I do see that we are getting close to time.
I will take
Let's
your
see.
handouts to the next meeting that I have with my
Yes.
agent when my turn comes up again. So
Yeah, please do. Yeah. And they can always reach out to any one of our partner biologists. Yes. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly touch on Maureen's question. Brush piles can attract other critters. That's a thing. So something to think about. So it's yeah, that's a reality of that situation. Is that good? Yeah, it depends on how much you like mice, rats, and cats, or rabbits. So it's not something that would bother me, but certainly something to think about. And where do birds fit in? Yes, birds are always a component of this. Insects are food for birds. And so if we are planting habitat for insects, we should be supporting birds on top of it. And birds are in dire need as well. So with that, thank you all for hanging in here. have fun at all your other sessions and have a great conference.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And we've got a Habitat community room that'll be starting right about now if you want to keep this wonderful conversation going. So you can head over to the Whova page to find the link to that Zoom. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.